welcome all of you to this wonderful faculty research lecture. These are the times when we as an intellectual community get to convene at the highest order and honor our colleagues and listen to ideas at the frontier. Let me say just a couple of words about faculty excellence because it is so defining of what this remarkable institution is about. I mean, in some ways, the most defining feature, right? It's why the whole world knows about us. It's why we've been able to push the frontiers of so many fields forward. One of the things my wife, Jen, who's here today, said to me just recently is, you know, at Berkeley, we're not afraid to be first. And I thought, well, that's an interesting way. I mean, that's kind of about, you know, how much intellectual risk are we willing to take? It's one thing to say, yeah, everybody wants to be first, but to be first, you know, each of us as scholars has a scar or two on our back because we went out a little further, a little sooner. And that's not always easy. So that's part of what faculty excellence, at least to me, means. You know, another part of faculty excellence, if I may, is I feel this among my colleagues. We're really here to lift each other, right? When we talk about commitment to the greater good at Berkeley, their commitment to the greater good people at lots of wonderful research universities, but it's really deep in our DNA. And I think part of how that manifests day to day as colleagues, as faculty members, is that we really are sort of rooting for one another. We literally lift one another. I think faculty evolve faster here. Our model was not hire the best faculty, let them rip. I think we really develop faster one another by being so invested in one another's success. So these are among the many, many ways to think about faculty excellence at Berkeley and where it comes from. For more than 110 years, Berkeley's Academic Senate has recognized 2 faculty members each year who embody this excellence to deliver our Martin Meyerson Berkeley Faculty Research Lecture. These distinguished professors have conducted research, as you know, that has changed the trajectory of their disciplines and more, and also, you know, of course, our understanding of the subject they have dedicated their lives and their careers to. The lectures shine a light on an essential part of our mission, pushing the frontiers of what is known. The curiosity and creativity that fuel the quest to learn and understand are at the heart of our commitment to making this world a better place through what we discover, what we teach, and the public service that we provide. This year's lectures represent the continuation of a treasured tradition that has recurred annually with one exception. In the wake of World War I and the influenza pandemic, the faculty research lectures were suspended in 1919. Being selected to deliver a faculty research lecture is rightfully seen as a high honor. To stand out among peers who already themselves exemplify academic excellence is no small feat here at Berkeley. For students, members of the campus community, and the public, this is a wonderful way to experience scholarly research of the very highest caliber. I'd like to welcome the past recipients who are with us today. Professors, please stand when I read your name. We really do want to see you and recognize you. Let's hold our applause, if you would, please, until each on the list has been recognized. And please, when you stand, stay standing, because we want to salute all of you together. Robert Alter is here, Carlos Bustamante is here, Catherine Gallagher is here, Martin Jay is here, Victoria Kahn is here, Thomas Lacour, Tony Long, Stephen Lindau, Henry Brady, Marvin Cohen, Randy Scheckman, and Inez Fung. Congratulations to all of you. And thank you for being part of this community. We are proud of you and we appreciate all the pioneering work you have done. The 2 individuals chosen to give this year's faculty research lectures are Niklaus Largier, professor of German and Comparative Literature, and also Doris Tsao, professor of Neuroscience. Niklaus is the Sidney and Margaret Ancker Chair in the Humanities and distinguished professor of German and Comparative Literature. He received his PhD from the University of Zurich and joined UC Berkeley's faculty in 2000. He's held several leadership positions at Berkeley, including director of the Medieval and Religious Studies programs and chair of the departments of German and Comp Lit. Largier's research focuses on the history of emotions, of the senses, and of the imagination, particularly in the Middle Ages and the early modern era. Recent books have explored voluntary flagellation in Europe. I had to look that up and find out just how much of it is going on. The fascination with religious practices in decadent literature of the late 19th century, and how figures, which range from psalms to music to images, resist interpretation and instead constitute a mainly sensory experience. He's currently working on a book about the connection between symbolic forms and energetic moments, reaching from ancient Greek speech to late 19th and early 20th century humanists Ernst Cassirer and Abby Warburg. Please join me in welcoming our colleague, Niklaus Largier, whose lecture today is entitled Mysticism and Modernity. Niklaus, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chancellor Lyons, for these introductory words. It's indeed a great honor and somewhat unexpected, somewhat also embarrassing, but also a moment of, somewhat accomplishment. Thank you to the selection committee and the colleagues who nominated me for this, and thank you all for being here. Thank you all the colleagues and graduate students who actually, in a way, made this thought emerge or play the role in ways in which this took shape. So reading the word mysticism in the title of this talk, you might have thought of what I will be talking about, particularly here in California, probably as a kind of New Age thing. You might have been thinking of it as something religious or spiritual, or what is sometimes called also nowadays the return of religion. Or if we want to avoid the word religion, of traditions where ecstatic feelings are at the center, be it with the divine, with nature, with the universe, etc. All of this and much more along these lines has been included in the term mysticism since it has been invented in the 18th century, and that is actually when the term emerged. And when it has been applied, since then it has been applied to all kinds of what we call religious or spiritual traditions. Thus, identifying a feeling of oneness with the divine or an absolute or the cosmos or nature, people since the 18th, 19th century also started speaking of Buddhist and Christian, Jewish and Islamic mysticism, and I see people who know much more about these traditions than I do here in the room. So one started to speak of Buddhist, Christian, Jewish, Islamic mysticism, of nature mysticism, and so on, assuming that there is a comparable and universal experience at the core of these traditions. In doing so, they use the term that is inspired by a long history in Christian theology, but that has also been radically modified. While theologians since late antiquity spoke of mystical theology or of a mystical meaning of Holy Scriptures, using only the adjective and relating it to practices of prayer, contemplation, and reading, both Enlightenment critics on one side and mostly Catholic apologists on the other side turned mysticism into a noun, a thing, and a subjective experience. And finally, scholars turned it into a universalizing concept, applying it all over the world. When Immanuel Kant, I'll have a slide here. I thought slides would be a little bit more entertaining. I was told I should have a PowerPoint, which I often don't have. When Immanuel Kant and other Enlightenment philosophers who used the term spoke of mysticism, They saw it as a relic of a pre-critical attitude, as religious enthusiasm, using the German word Schwärmerei, and as a sign of dogmatism, something embodied in an exemplary way in the other figure you see here, namely Emanuel Swedenborg. These are the two figures I show you here somewhat emblematically. When religious thinkers used the terms, they did so in defense of a sphere of experience, as it is often called, that could not be reached by rational thought. When Enlightenment thinkers used it, they polemicized against old-fashioned beliefs. Speaking very schematically, and I risk this here, we could say that Immanuel Kant, on one side, stands for the analytical power of the word or of language. That Swedenborg, on the other side, stands for the symbolic force of language, and that since then, intersections of these two strains have taken shape in many forms. Let's leave it at that. There was a third line also. The philosopher Hegel and the European Romantics, I'll show you also, I don't have a picture of Hegel, but I have a picture of the two treatises that played an important role. On one side, it's Swedenborg's anonymously published Celestial Secrets, and on the other side is Immanuel Kant's, in German, Träume eines Geistersehers, Dreams of a Spirit Seer, the polemical treatise against the Swedenborgian thought. But as you all know, Swedenborg has played an important role throughout the 18th century, 19th century, even up to today, in what we could call esoteric traditions. More about that in a moment. So the third line, which Hegel, I don't have a picture, the philosopher Hegel and the European Romantics, they recovered and rehabilitated the word mystics, mysticism, mystical. Hegel, in speaking of mysticism as an anticipation of his notion of speculation, developing actually even a positive attitude towards the tradition of enthusiasm as something that should live on in his conceptual work. The Romantics, among them Wordsworth, Coleridge, Novalis in the German tradition, Baudelaire in the French tradition, I count him into this as well, to put it bluntly, in rediscovering a mystical intuition that breaks with the rational discursive order of the world and promotes inspiration, a creative imagination, a special feeling about the world. In many cases, Swedenborg became something like the patron saint in these traditions. In both instances, in Hegel and in the Romantics, however, also a new critical value, a specific critical impetus of what is called mystical came into view. This new reference to mysticism as a critical position with regards to a modern rationalized world accompanies us, we could say, throughout modernity, and we can speak of ever new rediscoveries of the mystical tradition in different ways, from the European artistic and literary movement known as decadence, and for Romanticism through Dadaism, Surrealism, up to the most recent interest in altered states of consciousness and the effects of psychedelics that we now study at Berkeley as well. It is, however, not the so-called mystical experience and its elusive content that I want to focus on here today. Also not the anti-rationalist stance, which I think is only partly true. What I find more fascinating and what I found more interesting in my work over the last years is the way in which 20th century modernists rediscovered the very practice that we encounter in many traditions that we call mystical. When I speak of modernism, and here I have a slide, I use the term in a very eclectic and broad way, presenting a group of artists and writers here just in an exemplary fashion, including the Dadaist Hugo Ball, you see him over there in a performance as a magical bishop in the Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich. Then an abstract painting of Wassily Kandinsky with his book, The Spiritual in Art. The constructivism of Hilma af Klint, but then also including writings or traditions of writings up to the experimental prose of Clarice Lispector. So what I will be speaking about here is neither the romantic moment nor the essence of an elusive thing that is called mystical experience, but instead the productive aspects that we should be thinking of in a modernist way. It is, to put it concisely, mysticism as constructivist experimentalism with ways of perception that I find most interesting. But before I go there, I have to address something that I see as a key misunderstanding. In the Western Christian tradition, it is this picture of an altered state of consciousness, as we would call it nowadays, that has become maybe the most famous scene, the most emblematic scene of mysticism. Yes, it's the right picture. I kind of don't trust the here totally. It is the picture of Teresa of Avila in ecstasy. She figures as the emblem of the most common take on mysticism, not least on many book covers, embodying a state of ecstasy. The fact that she does so is due not primarily to the famous episode in her life, in her Vita. It's like half a page where she describes an ecstatic moment. It is not so much due to the famous episode in her life that we know it, but to the representation of it that you see her in the sculpture of Gian Lorenzo Bernini's Baroque sculpture in the Coronaro Chapel of Santa Maria della Vittoria in Rome, a church actually celebrating the Catholic victory over the Lutherans under the sign of a holy icon. Here, and I can show you another picture just from the central apsis of the church. Here, as to use another moment, as on the cover of Jacques Lacan's Ancker, one of his seminaries, Teresa figures as the ultimate emblem of an experiential intensity where oneness with the divine and an erotic and aesthetic apex of pleasure converge. Needless to say, this emphasis on experience as it at its most intense, and I want to add all too obvious for modern readers who think of it, I would say, flatly as sexual, this experience or this notion often foregrounds a subjectivism with its emphasis on interiority and interior truth, on interior experience. But this, in fact, I would argue, is entirely foreign to what we find in the mystical traditions and in their emphasis on dramatic self-loss. In other words, to remain with this example for a minute, Teresa's life is not to be called a mystical text because of its emphasis on moments of experience that appear as ecstatically pleasurable and subjectively intense in modern eyes, but because of its deep investment in the questions of how a life of prayer, more about that in a moment, artfully modifies the perception of the world, of selves, of gender, of community. Here you see her somewhat different as an author, a writer, an inspired writer, which is usually eclipsed. Thus, in emphasizing mystical experience, modern turns toward mysticism often foreground subjective intensity, absorbing pleasure, a kind of singular jouissance, and turn it into the essence of what is supposedly at the core of the tradition. Other elements like detachment, self-loss, abandonment, etc., quite generally altered states of consciousness, lend themselves to the same kind of adaptation in terms of subjective experience. But all this, I would say, at least for the purpose of this lecture, is not at the center of Theresa's pedagogy and authorship, nor is it at the center of the interest of the modernist readers of her texts. Indeed, when I speak of a life of prayer, that is the object of the other many pages of Theresa's so-called mystical text. Yeah, her text, the Bernini episode is a half a page in a text of 200 pages that deal in a way with prayer and contemplation and the ways in which that could be figured. So indeed, when I speak of a life of prayer, this doesn't seem as exciting as this ecstatic moment, which fills barely half a page in her Vita, as I said. What I will try to do here is to show that the contrary is the case, and that in particular modernist thinkers, poets, painters, and composers, that they have been fascinated primarily exactly by that, not the ecstatic pleasure or the self-loss, but the life of prayer as a constructive technique, a deployment of language and of rhetorical devices with the goal to play with, experiment with, and give a new shape to human perception. What modernist authors focusing themselves on montage, configurations of effective expressive moments, on defamiliarization and experiments with perception, what they find in the mystical tradition that they read, what they find are the same ways and forms of experimenting with perception, as I said, that we find in Dadaism, in constructivist art, or in music from Schoenberg to Cage. All of them reference these mystical sources in their works at some point. This might also come as a surprise to all the readers of William James's classic work, The Varieties of Religious Experience, which I have here with a slide, and typically you will see again Teresa in one of the exemplars that you can buy blended in with that. Here in James, in a point of view that has shaped the 20th century, interior experience or intense, overwhelming experience turns into the very center of the writings of the mystics across times and cultures. Instead, I argue here, or I want to argue, mystical texts in focusing on the practice of prayer think and write about the conditions of human perception and its malleability, about the ways experience takes shape, and above all, how sensual, affective, and cognitive sides of self and world can be changed, modulated, amplified, reconfigured. To put it bluntly, provocatively, and maybe a bit enigmatically, what we call mysticism can, I think, should be understood as an art of addressing our imagination in its material form, that is, as it is constitutive of all experience we make, as a place where sensation, emotions, cognition enter into a new circulation time and again. In doing so, the mystical texts explicitly think in terms of what we nowadays would call media and techniques. They think of scenes of defamiliarization in withdrawing from the everyday into the cell or the study. I have a picture here with a cell from San Marco in Florence, actually with a Frangelico fresco. And then on the other side, just to give a little bit of historical context, what I find interesting, in the humanist tradition, a studiolo, a study room, which in both cases emphasize, both pictures, a mediatedness of perception, a mediatedness of the exercise of reading, of understanding, etc., as it happens in these places. So I said there is a moment of defamiliarization at stake, that is a withdrawing into a space. A withdrawing, and you can always think of it, withdrawing into the cell, withdrawing into the desert, withdrawing onto a mountaintop, all these topoi exist in the history. Then they think of language, images, and music as the devices that serve the purpose of producing a new perceptual environment. You can think of this here with, on one side, the studiolo of the humanist scholar, but in the monk's cell, obviously, as the place where there's an image display, there is a text that is being sung, etc. And all this forms in that situation of withdrawal you could say the media technological setting for the modification of perception. I hope all this will be a little bit clearer by the end of my talk, and it will, I hope, also become clear why and how some of these modernist writers, artists, and composers most recently never refer. So, yeah, one moment. It will hopefully also become clear why they refer to what seems to be an esoteric or spiritual content that I try to ignore up to the end of this paper. So let me start with a modernist figure who is key for me, has been all my graduate students here, if you know about that, ad libitum. Since I'm working mainly with German literature. So the figure I'll talk about for a moment is Robert Musil, the author of the novel The Man Without Qualities, in its title, inspired actually by an expression of the medieval mystic Meister Eckhart. The notion of being without qualities actually is a rephrasing of an old philosophical idea that Eckhart uses, namely that the human mind can know everything, even they say can become everything, because in itself it is nothing, as it goes. Applied with a theological and anthropological emphasis, it makes it possible to speak of the human mind, and I want to include here, in a somewhat medieval psychological sense, sensation, emotional life, rational life, cogitatio, all together. Applied with a theological and anthropological emphasis, it makes it possible to speak of the human mind as not determined in its nature, but open and malleable, that is, shapeable, as always exposed to the formative forces of languages and cultural artifacts. Musil will speak of this explicitly in terms of the formlessness of the human. Robert Musil was an engineer by training at first, then engaged in research on human perception with his teacher Ernst Mach. It is during his scientific studies of human perception, an important field in the early 20th century in Europe, during these studies that Musil has become interested in the mystics and in the fact that the term mysticism is not just referring to a divine or ultimate experience, but to an experimentation with what he calls the formlessness of the human, and an experimentation with the help of language and rhetorical devices. Let me first just quote a passage of his text. Many of you might actually know it, in order to illustrate how he unfolds these ideas. In the 4th chapter of The Man Without Qualities, in a famous few lies that some will know, Musil writes, to pass freely through open doors, it is necessary to respect the fact that they have solid frames. This principle is simply a requisite of the sense of reality. But if there is a sense of reality, and no one will doubt that it has its justification for existing, then there must also be something we call a sense of possibility. He then continues, whoever, a longer passage, whoever has it does not say who has this sense of possibility, does not say, for instance, here this or that has happened, will happen, must happen, but he invents here this or that might, could, or ought to happen. If he's told that something is the way it is, he will think, well, it could probably just as well be otherwise. So the sense of possibility could be defined outright as the ability to conceive of everything there might be just as well, and to attach no more importance to what is than to what is not. The consequences of so creative a disposition can be remarkable and may, regrettably, often make what people admire seem wrong and what is taboo permissible, or also make both a matter of indifference. Such possibilists are said to inhabit a more delicate medium, a hazy medium of mist, fantasy, daydreams, and the subjunctive mood. But the possible includes not only the fantasies of people with weak nerves, but also the as yet unawakened intentions of God. A possible experience or truth is not the same as an actual experience or truth minus its reality value, but has, according to its partisans at least, something quite divine about it, a fire, a readiness to build, and a conscious utopianism that does not shrink from reality, but sees it as a project, something yet to be invented. What Musil mentions and there's a lot to say about this, going deeper in the text, what is interesting is obviously that the moment of enthusiasm comes back just in that motif of the fire that emerges in these lines. What Musil mentions in this passage is something he reflects upon and importantly, more importantly, produces in his style of writing. That is, the very production of possibility takes place not in thinking of what might be possible for him, not in imagining a concrete situation that might or should become reality, but instead in the play with language and its effects that makes situations emerge with all their emotional, relational, cognitive aspects. This comes about, in Musil's eyes, through a specific use of comparisons, similes, the use of words that disrupt the textures of the real, replace established patterns time and again, and open an experimental sphere of situations through variation, enumeration, incongruency, analogy, in short, through the play with language, or to a strategic use of words in order to produce, to interrupt, to shape, to reform perceptual worlds we inhabit. This practice makes emerge a realm of possibility that, as I like to say, nests in what is conventionally accepted as the real, producing new worlds out of the old ones and modifying the life of perception in its environment with help of the play with the efficacy of language. The modern essayistic novel, as Musil writes it, is in fact the medium, the very space in which thought and language experiment upon themselves and upon the forms of the human that emerges from this. Obviously, it's a little too long. That always happens. I'll jump a little bit, but with the question. So what does this have to do with mysticism, you might ask? We do indeed seem far from Teresa's life of prayer. There are, however, two parallel lines of thought that are at work here for Musil when he thinks about his use of language and technique. On one side, it is the experimental psychology he was involved with since his days as a student of Ernst Mach in Berlin. In particular, it is a study of the experimental psychologist Carl Girgenson that brings both things together for Musil. Focusing on the emergence of sensations and emotions, Girgenson had studied the effects of language, in particular prayer and church song, on experimental subjects at the time. Concretely, he explored, to put it in my terms here, how the words and forms of prayer texts were to be understood in terms of the formation, amplification, transformation of emotions, and more generally, the perceptual and cognitive life. Ironically, reflecting the contemporary interest in mystical traditions, Girgenson, in this, it's a fat book, also used Martin Buber's ecstatic confessions, ecstatische Confessions, an exploration of Hasidic mysticism. He used it as material alongside his experimental cases and just built it into the book. So it is here with Mach and other scientists and Girgenson who understand the human as a bundle of perceptual and cognitive events that suddenly prayer as a concrete and exemplary practice, a linguistic practice, regains this value as a practice of formation of perception and cognition that it had in earlier times. What Girgenson depicts on the basis of his empirical psychology and what Musil adopts in view of his poetics is that the very practice of prayer in these situations is not meant as a transmission of a message or a content, human speaking to God, but that it is primarily invested in modulating sensations, senses, feelings, and understanding. It modifies the environment and the perception of self and world in the way, we could say that's maybe the easiest way to understand it, in the way a piece of music might. Only that here, all there is the effect of the use of words. As surprising as it might seem, this very situation is actually what is addressed in medieval treatises about prayer and contemplation. That is about the very practices that are at stake or in the tradition of what is called mysticism. Again, mystical does not refer here for me to an esoteric meaning or content, but to the very effect of the words and of the composition of words. Let me take just one example, namely a text about prayer that the 12th century monk and theologian Hugh of St. Victor, for me a figure of major importance for the history of medieval Christian mysticism, wrote, and I brought a little slide here too. You can imagine, obviously we don't have any portraits of Hugh, but there is here obviously a monk teaching other monks, but I wanted to juxtapose this in first, because it is really what a wide range of women writers in the Middle Ages engage with, namely this theory of Hugh that I just will present, and there's also the little dog, which is a special dedication to Tom Ancker, who I've heard here speak about dog when I saw the slide. So what Hugh asks when he discusses forms of prayer, is, so there's all kinds of prayer. We try to say something to God, we ask something from God, etc. But then why, he asks, do we spend our days singing the Psalms, which is the key prayer, what they call, and why do we call this prayer, even the most important prayer? And why do we, going from there, produce more complex prayer texts, pulling from the Psalms, pulling from other texts? That's where the whole montage situation comes into play. You're configuring new texts along these lines, inspired largely by the Psalms. And to make this sound even more modernist, we see him and others ask, why do we engage in the montage of texts and in multimedia installations? Why do we combine these texts with these text pieces, with images, with music, with light, etc.? Think of the whole liturgical drama that appears. And they talk about it in terms of artificium meditationis. According to Hugh and the so-called mystical authors, prayer is to be understood at first in terms of what we call a spiritual exercise, but a spiritual exercise that shapes the life of the mind, they would say the life of the soul, encompassing all its aspects, and thus shapes emotions and thoughts in movements of stimulation that make use of the efficacy of the words that are being used. It does so in a way that is meant to shape, the use of language is meant to shape, as he says, innumerable forms and nuances of sensation and emotions that humans can experience. You see, again, the resonance of the trope of the shapelessness of the human who potentially can explore all these emotional and sensual but also intellectual nuances. It's not, these texts don't operate with an opposition of rational and irrational that we, since the Enlightenment, cultivate. He says the number of the affects are infinite, and it's impossible to, as he says, count them all. They emerge, and this is the key point, in a practice that moves from a state of unexcited reading or remembering of the sacred texts to moments of intensified perception, emotion, and thought, of cognition in this process. The transition to states of emotional intensity, the goal of the practice, is called meditative reading, which exercises a shaping force on the ways of perception, assimilating the life of the soul to the effects of the words that are being used. Meditative prayer, in that sense, devoid of intention, not being directed to transporting a message at all. Meditative prayer, devoid of intention, is, in his mind, he calls it frequent mental re-evocation of words. A process of rumination is what the medieval authors use, of rumination, mastication, of digesting, using this terminology in which perception is being reshaped. This, Hugh explains, happens in the performance of the singing of the Psalms as meditative prayers that produce a modulation of the life of the soul. On this background, then, we can also imagine all the experimental practices that come into play. And when you read medieval texts that address this, you find a kind of a tradition of dramatization, playful dramatization, we could call it, from a modern point of view, that works with these rhetorical devices in order to modulate and explore the possibilities of the life of the soul. Obviously, I'm ignoring something here, which is there is a directionality that is given. There is grace, there is love. There are these moments of ultimate goals that are there at the end of the practice. But since it is a practice that is done here on earth in time, and since thus this can never be reached, what remains is the engagement in this stimulation, what we could call it. You could say, for example, Hugh argues, a list of pains, an enumeration of all possible evils, will produce the effect that soul experience number of affects of pain and suffering. The more impressive and comprehensive the montage of texts, the more the soul explores the possibilities of a broad range of emotions. And in his discussion of the singing of the Psalms and the effects produced in the practice of montage of texts, images, and music, Hugh shows how they serve the purpose of weaving rich textures and reweaving rich textures of feelings, assimilating the perceptual soul, the perceptual life, to the composition of the text. In a similar way, the soul can move itself into a state or states of admiration, pleasure, praise, etc., when it invokes or when she invokes tropes of divine beauty and happiness. The movement on a more abstract level that is at stake here can also be characterized as a denaturalization of perception and cognition, the transition from the literal and empirical everydayness, the dullness, so to speak, of our boring existence caught up in normative context, to a world of playful experimentation. This happens in prayer, not in form of an articulation of a dogmatic content, but of a rhetorical practice, a new shaping of the life of sensation, feeling, and knowing through a targeted use of language. This defamiliarization can be seen as a withdrawal, as I said, into the cell, the study, the desert, the mountaintop. It is complemented by the installation of rhetorical devices that then produce all these new events. It is this practice that Musil, and I take him here as the exemplary modernist, engages with in his adaptation of the so-called mystical tradition. Working with the seemingly modern theorem, as he calls it, of the formlessness of the human, he rearticulates the medieval mystical saying that mankind can turn into everything, and working with words and similes along the lines of a continuing defamiliarization and perceptual reconfiguration in experimental scenes inspired by the prayer dramatics, we could call it. He rearticulates the mystical theories of prayer and understands these as production of ever new Zustände. He uses, in German you have the Aggregatzustand. I wonder in English it's phases, yeah, like water, what is it? Iced water and vapor. Yeah? So he uses a term here that is inspired by the language of physics and chemistry, and he thinks of this as states of matter and pieces of matter. So now I have to come to a conclusion and ask, so what about what I decided to ignore earlier? Yeah, let me get back for a moment, just a few minutes. I know that maybe your patience goes for another couple of minutes. I hope so. What I excluded, namely what I called the esoteric or spiritual content of the references to the mystics and mysticism. I call it esoteric. Oh, here I had one picture that I forgot because I jumped over something. What is fascinating is that, I just added now as a little add-on because it wasn't there. What is fascinating that an entire generation of French feminist critique, whom I show here, you see Julia Kristeva, whose last book actually is a book about Teresa of Avila, you see it all the way on the left, and then Hélène Cixous, they picked up on the poetics and that the medieval women writers developed on the basis or in their own engagement with Hugues' practice of prayer. So that's a little footnote. So yeah, what about what I called the esoteric? What I ignored up to now are the practices that I described above are indeed often associated with an intimacy with the divine, the absolute, or in other instances, particularly in the 19th and 20th century, with occult knowledge about the world, or to use a modern term, an altered state or altered states of consciousness. While we can see many nostalgic, reactionary, enthusiastic returns that make use of the mystical in terms of a lost unity, the loss of an enchanted world, or the recovery of all kinds of authenticities, I want to keep emphasizing the constructivist and modernist experimental line here. And I want to do so to come to a conclusion with a particular emphasis on the fact that the mystical engagement, as I portray it here, is not about the recovery of a true or lost nature, but most often about a specific engagement, as I try to portray with language, traditions, with cultural and social memory. This is and should be, I think, also at the core of the teaching of these materials, both the earlier medieval texts and the modern engagements with them. I will take once again a short detour in order to illustrate this. In a letter to the scholar of Jewish mysticism, Gershom Scholem, Walter Benjamin wrote the following in defense of Franz Kafka, in defense of Franz Kafka's imagination, if you want. Kafka lives, Benjamin put it, in a complementary world of, quote, characters that are part of an experimental process. Benjamin wrote further, Kafka's work is an ellipse whose widely separated foci are determined by mystical experience, and then he adds, which is above all an experience of tradition on the one hand, by the experience of the modern metropolitan man on the other. He adds, going on, that for Kafka, the forces of tradition had to be appealed to should an individual, in the ads, whose name was Kafka, be confronted with the reality that projects itself as ours. Thus, Kafka, as Walter Benjamin points out, held on to transmission, reactivated the forces of tradition, living, again, quote, in a complete lack of illusion about the age and yet a wholehearted commitment to it. Once again, mobilizing something in the mystical way, Benjamin insists, is not to be seen as the experience of a return to esoteric beliefs about the world, but as a specific form of engagement with the forces that are embedded in tradition. The cultural archive, actually the very forces that make up our consciousness in this abyss of complexity which tradition is. Strikingly, the African-American poet Nathaniel Mackey, who I added it together with the two others, I just find these pairs of eyes together with the eyes on the book cover incredibly striking. So strikingly, the African-American poet Nathaniel Mackey, offering next to Fred Moten one of the important recent engagements with mysticism along a different line of thought, speaks in the same vein of a mystical thrust in relation to what he calls tradition. In an essay that is inspired by the Austrian musicologist Viktor Zuckerkandl, whose background lies in the context of Musil's work and poetics, Mackey foregrounds a specific engagement with tradition, in his case, particularly the critical voice and potential of African American and African music and song. If Zuckerkandl thinks of music as a critique of our concept of reality, and there again, I would think of the critical tradition of the mystical way of speaking, if as Zuckerkandl thinks of music as a critique of our concept of reality and an articulation of what's left out of that concept of reality, and you can hear the resonance with Musil here, Mackey takes it as, I quote, a capacity for feeling which holds itself apart from non-contingency. It is this capacity I want to emphasize to move beyond non-contingency that it's there where the core of the mystical lies for Benjamin and Mackey alike. Not in terms of a return to an occult archive or an archive of secret knowledge, however, but of a specific form of engagement with language. It is an engagement that follows the logic of prayer in its modernist adaptations. In this sense, mysticism, or maybe better, mystical reading, always entails a pedagogy. It familiarizes the normative character of the tradition. It doesn't make tradition into a normative corpus. And for Benjamin and for Mackey, as for Musil and Hugo of St. Victor, it engages the formative force of the words as they make up both the material history of our consciousness and the possibilities of our imagination to transcend, in Mackey's words, the numbness of contingency in a world of race, class, wars, disaster, where there's no end, particularly at the moment. In the classroom, we can think of it as a reading of traditions that treats them not as dead archive or normative content, but as an archive that animates our imagination and that gains its liveliness from our engagement with it. The word mystical or spiritual in this context refers to nothing else than to recognizing in the lively, or to recognize in the liveliness of the archives we inhabit. If you allow me to end with a bit of pathos here, the potential for hope and the creation of new worlds. Thank you for your patience. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
We have time for just 2 questions, so if you want to raise your hand, I can bring you the mic.
I'm sorry, I avoided the question possibility.
I noticed that although you mentioned figures that draw their inspiration from communication with God, like Teresa of Avila or Hugh de Saint Victor, you did not mention the word God once.
Yeah.
So this was calculated, I take it.
Yes.
Tell us why.
Man, I mentioned the word divine. The divine comes up, I think, 3 times. Interestingly, one in the Musil quote and then in others. I did it, man, as you saw, I tried to move away from 2 patterns that dominate how mysticism is being defined since the 18th century and read since there. Yeah, before there is no such term. And it's a term whether people probably wrote about how this term has been applied to other traditions in certain ways, and this fixation on the intense, overwhelming experience. So I tried to go away from that because I think it is much more interesting and important to understand the practice that is at stake, how the coming about of these intense experiences are actually rooted in this very specific relation also to language and to rhetorical devices, and how important that is on one side. And then on the other side, I could speak about the theological stakes in all this a lot. But there is a turn towards, especially in the early 20th century, something that some people talked about in terms of atheist, mysticism, etc. It comes about after the French decadence, after Huysmans, etc. So there's a line of thought there. I just didn't want to get, we have limited time here, that's why I should stop, to get too much focused into that. I still think it is a very, very important element of the practice. That is exercised here, namely through these moments that are being produced, draw on something which is called divine grace and pull that divine grace into the formative moment. And that is necessary, now I'm being more theological, that is necessary in order to get outside the instrumentality of what otherwise dominates in that. So you want to exercise in a practice where you deploy all these devices, but you don't want to lose your freedom in using these devices instrumentally. That's why, in my understanding, you always have to stay in this experimental mode of reading. And it's only in this experimental mode of reading, now speaking theologically, that grace, as opposed to instrumentality, comes about. So But this is...
And if you have any additional questions, Professor Largier will be here about an hour after.
Well, Niklaus, that was a surprising connection that you made between mysticism and modernism, which you made quite convincing. So hats off to you.
Thanks.
But one question occurs to me. It seemed, if I followed you, that all your examples, or almost all your examples, involved artists, composers, writers, who had some kind of conscious engagement with mystical antecedents. Now, I think that there are at least some examples of modernists who participate in this radical disruption of conventional modes of expression in the interest, as you very nicely put it, of generating new modes of perception, who don't seem to be engaged with mystical antecedents. I'm thinking of Faulkner, for example.
Yeah. I don't want to build there kind of a necessary line that goes there. I don't know Faulkner enough, but there are other unexpected places I don't see in it. So I once asked Irina Paperno here about Shklovsky, because when you read Shklovsky and the moment of defamiliarization and that being jolted into a new perceptual situation. Yeah, that's what he says. And the stone becomes stonier, and so all these moments. There is an antecedent in the Orthodox, in the Russian understanding of prayer that actually very deeply resonates with that. So I'm just using that as an example where it is very unlikely. Or seems. But there is and I can't answer the question for Faulkner and American modernism in general, which matters. I'm too intimidated anyway to dare to do that. But I would still think that it emerges in a context of a cultural presence of these practices. I can't concretely speak to, but if you think about Wallace Stevens, there's in the German with Rilke, in the expressionist tradition. So there's many where it's not I don't want to make it a causal relation, but there's a survival of it, and some figures reference it explicitly, like Musil does in many instances, and some figures don't.
That's all the time we have for questions, but like I said, he'll stick around for any questions you do have.
Are you okay?
Thank you, Niklaus, from all of us. And there is a reception. If you can stay, please do. Just you talk about being jolted. You talked about the strategic use of words to create new worlds, the ecstatic experience of self-loss, and also, the connection of tradition and being reactivated with it. Mysticism, one of the things that came to mind for me, again, I'm an absolute non-expert in this field, but Berkeley has such a wonderful melding of intense rationality and openness to mysticism at the same time. Have you ever walked around this campus at night, dark, clear night, by yourself, and have you come upon the Campanile, lit up like you've never seen it before? That is not a rational experience. Have you gone to Cal performances and watched a dancer or a player that brought so much emotion you just didn't understand what was happening? I also remember the first time the Cal band played as we were coming out of COVID on those steps out there, and how overwhelming it felt. I think this surrender to self-loss and the creating of new worlds, this new shaping of the life of the senses. Thankfully, we're all engaged in it as much as I could imagine being engaged in it anywhere on the face of the planet. Thank you for providing words to understand some of this stuff at a little deeper level. We appreciate your talk. Thank you very much. And please do stay for the reception. And also on the 8th, on April 8th, is Doris Tsao, professor of neuroscience. She will be speaking on representing the visual world. And of course, recordings of both of these talks will be available a week after each event. Please come and enjoy. Thanks for coming.